Here at Fonseca, vintage port is what we are all about. Fonseca, we've been making vintage port since our first release, which is in 1840. And our reputation stands on the decisions taken by past generations of my family into deciding that ports are to be bottled as a vintage port. So what is a vintage port? A vintage port is the selection of the finest ports from very good years, which will spend the first 2 years of their life in these wooden vats until we have time to evaluate their potential quality. And if we feel that the ports for a particular year are good enough to be bottled as a vintage port, they will be bottled literally by gravity. They'll go from the vat into the bottle to then enter their phase of aging and maturing in the bottle. And this is what we're going to be showing today, is how to decant a bottle of vintage port. So when we decide we want to open a bottle of vintage port, what we're going to think about first is how old a vintage port we want to open. At what phase of its development is it going to be at? And that is going to determine the type of sediment that we're going to have in the vintage port. So if we're looking at a young vintage, here we are from the Guimaraens 2019, this vintage port was bottled in 2021, and so it's only had 3 years in the bottle. It still has very little sediment, and it has a lot of youthful primary fruit. That will be its main characteristic. Well, the 2012s at the moment are 12 years old. They've had 10 years in the bottle, and you'll get the first sign of bottle maturity, but still a lot of fresh fruit. What happens in a younger vintage port, so we're talking about vintage ports up to 15, 18 years of age, is that the sediment will be very fine and it will not have agglomerated much. If we then follow the maturation of vintage port, and we have a 1997, so beautiful vintage at a wonderful moment of its age, because you've got now nearly 30 years of maturity and a great phase of vintage port. We have the classic 1985. 1985 was an extraordinary year. The 85 Fonseca is undoubtedly recognized as the benchmark of all vintage ports. And the 85's a year of characteristic intensity, structure, and it's extraordinary how fresh they are today. Now with 40 years on, it's a real classic. And vintage port will keep maturing easily for a century in the bottle. And we got the great 1927. Well, that's a legend in itself. And by the time you get to this age, you would have lost a lot of the color, but the complexity will be very fine. Within vintage port, we have one further differentiation which is important to note, in that here we have the 1997 Fonseca Classic Vintage Port, and alongside we have the Fonseca Guimaraens 2012. These are vintage ports in exactly the same right. They both come from the 3 Fonseca properties, Penascal, Cruzeiro, Santo Antonio. The only difference is our judgment about the aging potential. So we know that this will have the potential to age for 80, 100 years, like the 27s. The Guimaraens vintage ports, because they don't have the same structure as the classic, what happens is that they will reach their drinking window sooner and they won't have the same aging potential. But still, we're still talking about ports which will age beautifully for 50, 60 years and make a very fine vintage port. So now is the big decision, which vintage are we going to open? The 2019, youthful, lots of fruit, not a lot of sediment yet. I'm not going to open the 2019. 2012, well, that could be a good choice. However, being a vintage port which had 12 years in the bottle, the sediment's very fine, so we're going to be very careful. There's still lots of youth, but I'm not going to open the 12. 85, incredible vintage made by my father. I'm going to save that for another occasion. And I'm certainly not going to open today the 27. So today we're going to decant the 1997 Classic Fonseca Vintage. Now we have our bottle that's been standing up for a few hours or maybe even 24 hours. And the first step that we're going to take is to remove the capsule. So having removed the capsule from the neck of the bottle, we'll be taking the port tongs, which we have over this burner, to make sure that the tongs are sufficiently hot, preferably red hot, to then put over the neck of the bottle. And the heating up of the neck will then allow us to take the cold water to pour over the neck of the bottle and do a perfect crack and break off the neck and remove the cork at the same time. Perfection. We have got a very clean cut. This is the best way to remove a cork from a mature bottle of vintage port. And we're now going to proceed to decanting this magnificent 1997 Fonseca Classic Vintage Port. We carefully decant it, making sure that all the heavy sediment stays in the bottom of the bottle. And voila. And here we have a very fine example of a perfectly decanted 1997 Fonseca Classic Vintage Port. This vintage port is now 27 years of age. It's had 25 years in the bottle. It had plenty of sediment, but the sediment was well agglomerated, so it separated perfectly in the decanting. So this beautiful marzipan, spicy bottle age maturity, but still plenty of fruit to carry it, not only to enjoy now with a good cheese, but if we want to hold on to our other bottles for a few more years or even a couple more decades, it's going to be a port that's going to live for a long time still. Absolutely delicious. Cheers.